It's our perspective, and I think you would agree with me, that we've noticed a lot in the work that we do at Right Management that the world of work is changing. This isn't a real surprise, I'm sure, to anyone. There are a lot of changes happening demographically in our talent world. We have lots of different technologies that we're using in the workplace. It really changes how we work, where we work. We have customers who have incredible expectations beyond what they've had in the past. And then we have individual employees that often have more power in situations, which is a good thing, but more individual choice. So it really has just created a different dynamic in our workplaces that has really kind of stepped up the bar for what we need to be doing with respect to succession management. So we just look at this as a real opportunity to bring out the new way of working. Those of us that do this for work of organizational development would say this is really perhaps the old way of OD, systems thinking and noticing these changes. But for many, and I would say having been an HR practitioner, it's a little bit of a new way to some of our people that we're working with in the HR fields. So the first step in this transition, we would argue, is really moving from, you know, a relatively limited kind of thinking around succession, where if you ask clients what they're doing, they would talk to you about a chart with colors on it, and we got a few people at the top that we're looking at. And it really was a replacing mindset. We're replacing people. It was an HR-led process, not very integrated with the business, and you know, pretty haphazard in how it happened, and not very structured in its approach. And that's really changing. We're finding that the organizations that are really understanding these changes that are happening in the workplace are much more open to looking at this as really a long-term viability option and seeing it more as a strategic workforce kind of change. So even the term succession, I have to tell you, I was struggling with, should I call this something other than succession management? Because really it's strategic workforce consulting, right? It's kind of understanding it in a much more holistic way. So it really changes the way that we're looking at this. It is much more strategic. It tends to be not led by HR. So we really are keen to find ways to partner with the business. HR becomes the enabler. And again, I worked in HR. I love HR. But HR can't lead these sorts of things. It has to be led by the business and the line to really be embraced. Otherwise, we're kind of always trying to push a rock uphill to try to get them to embrace something that they feel is something HR wants them to do, as opposed to something they need to do for the business. So really that whole process changes the way of thinking. And if you needed any more details around why this is important, it's kind of shocking, but if you start asking organizations, you know, can they think of someone that would replace their CEO? Very few, so less than half actually have someone ready for that. If you ask them to come down the leadership pipeline and say, okay, the next 2 or 3 levels down, do you have any successors for those roles? Well, my goodness, we're down to, you know, well less than 30%. It really dwindles down to 20% less. So, you know, we're really finding that from some of the research that's been done, that there's a considerable opportunity here to think about how we do strategic workforce planning and building our leadership pipeline all the way through the organization. So lots of opportunity. I think it's interesting, one of the studies that we had done, our clients were telling us that, you know, less than 10% of them could actually monitor and track the effectiveness of their own efforts in this area. So even doing it and knowing how effective they are in it is pretty difficult to do. So just so much opportunity. This is the flip side of looking at it, but not a lot happening and lots more that can be happening. And one of the ways that we like to look at this from a systems perspective is using something that we call the organizational effectiveness framework. We really think about the business environment as a whole with leadership at the center here. So we're saying, you know, your strategy needs to drive the kind of leadership that you need to have in the organization. We all know that from those of us that have done competency work. It also needs to impact your structure, your capability, and your capacity. So how you design your organization should relate to what kind of business, what kind of strategy you have, and also your people and your systems. So all of that is integrated in a holistic systems perspective. And obviously underpinning that is your values and culture that you need to kind of, it's the rich soil that we all grow in, right? When it's right, it really works. leadership's at the core of that, and out of all of this comes those great things we look for: engaged employees. When we know our employees are engaged, having been a service manager, I can tell you, your best employees paired with the customers, boy, those are great outcomes. It's just a natural thing that happens. You get better customer experiences. And guess what? Then you have more effective businesses. It's just a natural kind of chain that happens here. So leadership's at the core of that. And succession in leadership is also at the core of that. And that's where we need to really, from a systems standpoint, change our thinking about why we're doing what we're doing throughout the organization. And then really, we like to have a process that's somewhat structured, I will say, starting with strategy, looking at the business side to really understand what are the business imperatives, looking then at, okay, well, what would be then the organizational performance expectations? How does the organization suss up in terms of, our capabilities and resources? How are we doing there? We go further and help them look at what are some of the critical roles and the success profiles. You can do this in kind of a less structured way, but there are real, I would say I work with a whole bunch of industrial psychologists that go through a very structured process here. So you can go with real rigor in this process, but even just knowing which roles are key and having a strong sense of what those competencies are is really what's at the core of that process. And then having all of your talent processes, and I'll show some of these later, that flow through. You can also customize this process. You can see the lower approach there is some of the individual processes that start happening. Once you're doing that talent review, you actually then have to go further. You're actually assessing the individuals, providing them feedback. You're having a rigorous approach around their development, which links back to the selection, promotion, and all the monitoring. So this probably sounds like a lot more than succession, and it is, because it's got to pull through in all of these talent processes for it really to work well. And we have different ways of doing this in terms of how do we help clients define the business imperatives. I think sophisticated organizations, or maybe ones that are in industries where it's fairly clear what we're doing, it might be easier to come up with these imperatives, but in our experience, many times they're just not as clear as they need to be. Organizations need to do more work on this, so we have a survey amongst some other tools, some interview protocols that we use to help them get more clear. And then we often do leadership alignment sessions if they're not in agreement to help the leaders get more clear on what are the business imperatives so we can line everything up from there. Establishing the organizational expectations, the metrics that come out of that. You would all know as OD professionals, this is where the customization comes in. It's just not a cut and paste. We can't, unfortunately, say, well, we're going to do the ones over there and link them over here. So you really have to go through that process of thinking through, again, what are the strategies? How would we actually then implement them? What would be some of the key areas we would be working on? Those measures that we would be paying attention to. And, there's some different examples there, which at this point, I won't go through in detail in the spirit of moving on. In terms of, how would you then look at how might we assess our organizational capabilities, whether it's all the way through, the strategic, the business strategy processes, looking at our performance management systems, looking at some of our capabilities reports. We have different ways that we help our clients to do this, and I mentioned the critical roles as well. So some different tools and processes that we find can be helpful. And I should say that we're not doing all of these with every client. It's customizing, but following the steps, right? And then figuring out which of the tools would be, or processes would be appropriate to help our clients. Determining critical roles and success profiles. Again, I mentioned this can be a very rigorous process that for those of you that have maybe gone through this with IO psychologists, helping you determine what the competencies are. That would look like taking a group of your best performers in key roles and interviewing them to determine what are those competencies, then being able to write the structured behavioral statements. You can see, if you can read that very small print, some examples of where you start to break out what does that behavior actually look like so that you can build those profiles. And you can do this for all kinds of, technical as well as leadership roles. Much of our work tends to be focused on the leadership side, but important to be able to structure that through. so that you've got some sense of the competencies. I'll stop here and say for a moment that I have mixed feelings sometimes about competencies, because I worked in an organization at one point that the competencies were so complicated that it was a bit mind-boggling. All these levels, and I watched people try, and myself, just trying to navigate through them. So I'm probably more biased on, keep it simple, but we still need to define what's important in the role, and we need to be able to be specific around what does it look like when you're demonstrating those behaviors, and how can we assess our own development or where others are at so that we can help them grow. So even if it's not multi-leveled, multi-layered, you have to, I think, spend some time to think through what those behaviors really are. So this is kind of key for me, this particular one, but doing it in a way that actually is usable, it's practical. We also, we do support our clients to consider their talent review process. So once you're looking at, we know what the key roles are, we're looking at individuals in those roles, we know what the behaviors look like, we can assess people. We actually do want to have talent profiles on them as well, so we're capturing some of that good data about them and going through some of the, talent review kinds of conversations where you're looking at performance versus potential, whether it's a 6-block or a 9-block kind of process where you're breaking out the individuals and trying to map them. Much of that conversation, in my opinion, it's really a calibration exercise, and it's very, very useful for the managers in the room to try to, explain, well, here's why I think my employee, has got such great potential. And somebody else is saying, well, no, actually, I don't really see them showing up like that. Here are some of the behaviors. Or we end up in sort of debates around, and when I led some of these at Best Buy Canada, really seeing how can we all get on the same page around what are the measures of performance and potential. And when we talk about somebody who's meeting or exceeding performance, what does that really look like? Because we all know that one of us can rate easy and the other might rate hard, but when you look across the organization and you're trying to make talent decisions as a whole, you need to have some consistency in that approach. So these talent review sessions become the ways that managers are really being educated in the performance management processes, and having to come and defend their people and then get agreement of where they sit in that box. It's an uncomfortable process, but it's a good process. So, so the talent review, I've spoken a little bit about that. It really needs to be integrated into the business process. So, when will you do it in the cycle of when you're doing performance reviews, or after you've done performance reviews in preparation for, often organizations are using it as well, not just for development, and for consideration of promotion, but also for, in some organizations, consideration for payment of bonuses. And so, as an example, when we were at Best Buy Canada, we actually did a bit of an unusual approach to the boxes. We looked at not performance and potential, we did performance and the values, because at that time Best Buy was trying to drive, are we living the values? And we had parts of the organization that thought that, as long as I was hitting my numbers, it didn't matter how many people I was losing in the ditch behind me. So we could have a lot of turnover in certain parts of the organization because people were pushing. And to be fair, there were parts of the organization that were very difficult to work in. Merchandising was one of them, where the merchants are having to buy product, negotiate with the buyers, and they put a lot of pressure on the advertising and other groups. So unfortunately, we saw that in HR. It was like a revolving door of people that would come in and they were all stressed out and then they were quitting, right? And so when we started making it very clear to our leaders were going to be assessed on whether or not they were living the value of unleash the power of the people, that was one of our values, it fundamentally changed what was happening in the organization, because those leaders started getting feedback around what does a good merchant look like? Well, part of it is when you unleash the power of the people, you don't leave a wake of destruction behind you. So that was the first thing. They got the performance feedback. The second was in the review process, if they were doing that, we wouldn't allow them to be top box. So if they weren't top box, then they weren't getting, and there were considerable benefits in terms of bonus and options. So all of a sudden the penalty became very high. And much as you don't like to have that as your stick, it really can work. So it's about rewarding the right behaviors that you want, making sure that it's consistent through your processes. So you want to think about all the processes that you need to support the talent review and integrate it into your performance process. A lot of people don't like performance management. I would say that everybody needs feedback on their performance. We can't get better at what we do if we don't get feedback, and we need to find ways in organizations to make that not difficult, but a positive process that doesn't burden us too much with too much documentation, but helpful. So some of the things there that you can see, assessments and feedback kinds of processes absolutely help that. And then as a coach myself, I'm a big believer in development plans. You're probably not going to get better at things if you don't actually document that you have a plan to do that. And again, it doesn't have to be real fancy. I'm a big fan of let's put it on one page, but let's get it down there, our few goals, the things that we're working on, and have one plan that we come back to make sure that we use it throughout the year. I finally get to some things that you might have expected to see, succession charts and summaries. Once you've done all of that, you're going to have really good data to talk about who ought be considered for these more senior roles, right? So then you're going to have leadership pipeline data for all of these positions. And certainly succession charts are good things. You can see some that are by individuals or by roles. So some good examples of how you might consider doing that. And you will want to think about how will you monitor the progress of both individuals and the process itself, right, organizationally. So what is your process for success tracking? So having some documents and processes to do that. Am I out of time? 2 minutes, okay. You might also want to think about potential and how you measure potential. And I'll share with you some secrets that I've learned from these industrial psychologists that I work with. You do need to think about it's not just someone's performing well in the job they're in, that's performance, right? Potential is a little trickier. There's three parts that they look for here. There's definitely an ability, but there's also a desire. Do you want it? And they actually have ways of measuring it. And the commitment to follow through. They tend to use multiple assessments, multiple tools, and integrated reports. You really do want to be careful. The right tools that you're using, you want to make sure they're reliable and valid. Unfortunately, there are some out there that just aren't very good. So make sure that they're appropriately validated. And then you want to have a process to assess them. Here's some different ways of thinking about that, from personality to behaviors, leadership potential, derailers, and values. That's the Hogan Suite. If you don't know it, I really recommend it. You might consider change leadership and strategic thinking and cognition. So this is just an example. And then, of course, building up through the entire leadership pipeline. And the rest, I shall say, is probably enough said. Okay. Comments or questions in the minute that I have left? Sam.
And also, culturally, what are some prerequisites to actually be able to do some of what you're talking about?
This is a great question. I mean, I can tell you years ago, I worked at Royal Bank, and when we had high potentials, we designated them MPO, most promising officers, and it was a secret. It was never told to the individuals. That created some problems because people didn't know that they were special, and when they didn't think they were moving along quickly enough, guess what? They left. Even if you thought you were showing them enough and moving them along. So I'm not really very keen about keeping those secrets. I think the other thing is that we need to see this as opportunity for development. And if people don't know where they are, whether it's most promising or I need to improve, we're really doing a disservice. So I think I would say let's be open and honest and help people see where they are, and then work with them to try to get better or to keep being most promising, whatever that might be. So I lean towards share more information and find ways to do that that are helpful. Over here? Yeah.
Just thinking about when you do tell them, hopefully you'll have more than one showing
yes.
and they know about it. So then what happens from your perspective with the competition, the competitive environment, and how do you work with that?
I think that's a great question. I would say it goes back to, well, maybe the individuals themselves and how you tell them. But if you also make it clear that one of the things that we're watching is that leaders grow leaders, and so part of that good behavior is how they're behaving when they know, I'm being considered a leader, and what does that entail? So what am I looking for then in terms of the right behaviors? So I think that fundamentally changes how people show up if they actually perceive it to be not just a competition, a zero-sum game, but if we're all getting better, and in the process of demonstrating that I'm seen to be as an even better leader, you'll get more of those behaviors.
How well do these processes work in a low trust environment?
Well, yeah, that's challenging. I mean, trust is really the foundation, isn't it? So if I don't trust you, you're my manager and you're rating me and I don't think it's a fair rating, you go into meetings and you don't trust the other managers, that's going to be challenging for sure. That would probably be something, if it's really broken on the trust front, you'd maybe want to tackle that first to try to get that foundation.
But could you use a process like this to increase the trust?
I think it's a great question. If you come at it with the right intent, I think with real open dialogue and courage, and this is maybe where it's going to go next, I think if leaders are willing to sort of model the way, be open and honest about where they're at and the challenges, you've really got the right spirit in doing this. I do think you can pull that off, and I've seen those kinds of environments where leaders have been able to do that, but that takes a fundamental change and a lot of leadership courage to do that, and it doesn't always happen, I must say. There's usually too much ego, and yeah. Great question, thank you.